With how different, nuanced, and unique Hakari and Higuruma's abilities are, both also having their techniques being a part of their domain expansions, today, me and Blzkn are going to discuss the multiple scenarios that could happen with these two characters fighting each other. Blzkn, you want to say what's up to the viewers?
Hey, what's up everybody? Obviously, thank you FakeWeeb for having us, and yeah, I'm excited to collaborate on this video, so we'll see how it goes.
Of course. So unlike my previous versus battle videos where I go over each of the individual scaling before starting, we're not going to do that here. Instead, me and Blzkn will just bring up both of their necessary feats and physical stats when needed. However, what I will do is very briefly go over their hacks and abilities because, man, they are so layered and complex that, yeah, this fight really needs to be talked about in multiple scenarios and discussions. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into it. Starting with Higuruma, his domain expansion, Deadly Sentencing, appears and functions like a real-life court trial. So once the enemy is put on trial for a crime they've committed in the past, it's their job as a defendant to try and prove why they're not guilty. Going more into the specific details would be irrelevant for this battle, so the main takeaway here is that when the enemy is found guilty, depending on how heavy the crime is, they'll either receive the confiscation penalty, which takes away your curse technique temporarily, or receive the death penalty, which grants Higuruma a sword that can kill his opponent in one hit. Now, the death penalty also comes with confiscation, so the enemy's technique would still be removed. However, getting the death penalty is very rare because the rate of the crime has to be at least killing 2 people or more. So let's say you killed 1 person every month. YouTube, don't take this down. This is just a hypothetical for an anime video. But yeah, Judgment, who acts as the judge for the domain, wouldn't even give you the death penalty because it doesn't look at all your crimes together. Instead, it charges one specifically at a time. And even then, let's say you stabbed someone in the chest. Instead of getting charged for bodily harm and attempted murder, there's a possibility for Judgment to charge you with property damage via the knife ripping through the victim's clothing. And property damage is a lot less of a charge than killing somebody, so yeah, the chances of Hakari receiving the death penalty, well, me and Blzkn will get into that discussion later. Another thing about Higuruma's domain is that it isn't violent. Not only is there a literal no violence rule, but the domain itself doesn't have a sure kill factor, unlike most modern domains. There's only a sure hit that relies on a binding vow for Higuruma to explain the domain's rules up to a certain extent. This is actually a very important thing to know, as we will use this information for one of the battle's upcoming discussions. As for the rest of his hacks, Higuruma has a reverse curse technique powerful enough to regenerate an entire arm. He's also got domain amplification to neutralize others' curse techniques, and Higuruma's Jujutsu manipulation in general is that on a level similar to Sukuna, admitted by the King of Curses himself, as he's capable of pausing and resuming the progress of his curse technique while activating and deactivating domain amplification. Even a sorcerer as strong as Kashimo admitted that the sharpness and efficiency in being able to do that is unreal. Moving on to Kinji Hakari, his domain expansion, Idle Death Gamble, is based on a real-life pachinko machine. Once casted on an opponent, the opponent's brain will be flooded with the details and information about his domain. That's kind of the harmless sure hit effect, the info dump part. Now, we don't actually have to go over the process of Hakari's domain in depth because it's kind of irrelevant to their battle, unless you think base Higuruma could defeat base Hakari before he lands a jackpot, though that's very unlikely considering elite sorcerers like Kashimo and Uraume couldn't do that. I mean, sure, Hakari obviously got the jackpot faster against them by being in either the increased probability stage or the faster spin stage, but if his physical stats are better than Higuruma's in general, and we will get into that later in the video, then it's rational to think that Higuruma with his gavel wouldn't beat up Hakari before he can land a jackpot in the normal stage. So yeah, once Hakari hits his jackpot, he and the opponent will get out of the domain, and that will lead Hakari to enter the mode where he becomes unkillable, because for the next 4 minutes and 11 seconds, Hakari is granted infinite cursed energy. So not only is all his stats boosted, but he even carries an automatic reverse curse technique hacks to heal any form or level of damage. This is due to the unlimited cursed energy reflexively performing RCT on his body, and the speed of his regeneration is set to surpass Gojo's and Sukuna's. That is not to be taken lightly, especially when we saw Hakari instantly heal his head the moment it was struck by lightning. Now, even when the 4 minutes and 11 seconds are over, Hakari can just use his domain expansion again and again and get more jackpots. Getting a jackpot will always be easier than the previous attempt, since the increased probability stage is a guaranteed jackpot for the next round. Unless Hakari lands on the time reduction stage, which has a 25% chance of landing there, then if Hakari were to constantly fail that stage a certain amount of time, then he'd go back to the normal mode, but Hakari can still get a jackpot pretty fast during the normal mode, so yeah, his hacks is absolutely insane. Now, with all the explanations out of the way, let's go over the different scenarios that their battle could have. The first scenario is if Higuruma unleashes his domain expansion upon base Hakari first. Realistically, I think this is the most likely thing to happen, since with the special way Higuruma's abilities work, his main style of fighting has to revolve around just using his domain expansion at the start of the battle. You might think that Hakari is the same, that he will also open his domain at the start of every battle, but he'll only do that if he knows that his opponent is pretty or decently strong. For example, he didn't use his domain at the start of the Charles fight, since Charles, before it was revealed that he could see the future, was pretty weak. Whereas in comparison to Higuruma didn't even know how strong Yuji was until he actually fought him. For all we know, Yuji could have been looked at as this subpar teen in Higuruma's perspective, which is possible since, again, he was later surprised of Yuji's raw physical strength. So with scenario number 1, could Hakari open his domain mid-court trial as a response to Higuruma unleashing his, or would the action of opening a domain breach Deadly Sentencing's no violence rule? What do you think, Blzkn?
So when he does, obviously, like you just established, every time we've seen Higuruma fight, obviously even the Sukuna one, there was a little bit more moments before he did pull out his domain. His main style of combat is to just use his domain on impact. Now, assuming through the fact that we know that he did have a lot of points during the Culling games before we ran into Yuji and etc., we can assume that you don't really have many counters once he's opened his domain. Like you said, the no violence rule, I mean, the domain expansion would be violent, so I would assume it falls in line, which means that Hakari most likely would not be able to actually use his domain at the same time. That means, to me personally, the way that this kind of clash would go would be focused on what result he gets from Judge Man's penalty that he does get, because we do know that Hakari has done some things with 1, beating up the higher ups. 2, he seems to be like a delinquent type figure. 3, he has the Fight Club, which until further notice has been deemed as illegal, which means there are some things that he can get penalized with. In terms of how severe the actual punishment will be is a different story, and I'm going to kind of get your opinion and see what do you think the worst punishment he could get. I do believe it would most likely get to a point where we just get a matchup where Higuruma wins on something, but he doesn't get the executioner sword, which to me, I still think base Hakari will be more than enough to deal with Higuruma, specifically for a couple reasons. The main reason, 1, is we see he was pretty overwhelming of Yuji when they first fought back until Yuji stopped fighting after he was trying to get Hakari's approval. And 2, we know that Yuji was fighting against Higuruma without any curse energy. He was still able to keep up with him, which just suggests to me that Higuruma isn't so physically imposing. A good example as well is that we saw in the moments where he was fighting with Kashima, anytime he got to his reach modes, he was able to keep up with him. Of course, Kashima was far in the ascendancy, was looking much stronger, but the simple fact that he could keep up with Kashima, who was going band for band with him when they were in jackpot, I believe it just showcases that his base form really isn't as weak. And the most important thing is obviously the clash with Urame, where we've seen that he managed to get a jackpot before obviously Urame really got going, which suggests that the community's perception of his base form really isn't as weak as people try to make out with him, because he can't be fighting against Urame, who's just a very bad matchup, and then even overpowering Yuji for those brief moments. Yes, we do know the context that he wasn't fighting. So I do think if we get to that moment where it is just a base clash between him and Higuruma, I think I edge Hakari to really be on top. But how do you feel in that situation?
Yeah, so there is a caveat I'd like to add with your no violence rule domain clash point, but before getting into that, I do agree with your take on Hakari beating Higuruma, both being in their base forms. Higuruma or Judgment is just not going to get the death penalty on Hakari, so all Hakari would get is just the confiscation penalty, meaning Higuruma wouldn't receive the executioner sword like you already mentioned. Now, what makes it a bit difficult in my opinion is Higuruma having reverse curse technique and a high level of cursed energy reinforcement. So while I do think base Hakari has the higher attack potency with his hard-hitting punches as you've scaled their strengths already, I don't think Higuruma is going to go down that easily, especially since he can just heal all those wounds with reverse curse technique. So this might come down to a battle of attrition where Higuruma just keeps healing and healing until he's run out of cursed energy and is low on stamina. If you're wondering why I'm not saying the same for Hakari, why I'm not assuming that he could run out of stamina first, it's because base Hakari should be able to land more attacks on Higuruma with his punches and kicks than Higuruma could land more attacks on Hakari with his size, changing gavel. This is where we have to look into their speed scaling. We know that before the time skip, Higuruma's combat speed was about equal to a cursed energyless post Shibuya Yuji, and now after the time skip, well, Higuruma is implied to have gotten stronger, but there wasn't any significant or apparent feat that really showed he got much better in the speed category. It's more emphasized around his durability and hacks. I mean, at best, we could probably say that his speed is relative to the current Yuji since he fought alongside him, but that's not really the clearest display. Whereas Hakari, on the other hand, there's more prominent feats in his base form that would establish he's faster than Higuruma. The first feat is when Charles, who could see 1 second in the future, he's looking straight at Hakari, and then suddenly Hakari disappears from his vision, hitting him from behind, meaning that Charles got perception blitz. If you don't think looking 1 second into the future is impressive enough, well, that same 1 second was enough for Yuta, who copied Charles's technique, to dodge and counterattack Sukuna in the most recent chapter. And then in the domain fight against Kashimo, who's one of the fastest characters without using his curse technique, it's Kashimo that starts moving first, and then Hakari, for a couple of panels, is able to keep up with him. Yes, Hakari does get overwhelmed and get saved by his pseudo spins, but these feats, compared to Higuruma's, are rational enough to prove that Hakari wouldn't really struggle when it comes to evading Higuruma's gavel attacks. Not saying that he'll dodge every single one of them. Higuruma can definitely land some hits via tricking Hakari by changing the size, but I still think Hakari would get most of the hits. So even if Higuruma can just heal all his heavy punches, eventually it'll be Higuruma who drains all his stamina first due to constantly using reverse curse technique. And now, regarding their domain clash, while I do agree with your point that the activation of a domain is normally an act of violence, because semantic-wise, any and all violence is prohibited, I think there could be an argument made for Hakari to get away with that, because his sure hit effect is stated to be harmless, and I don't think trapping an enemy in a domain barrier in general is violent. It's only violent because of the domain's sure hit, sure kill, and sometimes its environment, like Jogo's hot burning lava. But Hakari's doesn't really have a dangerous environment, nor does he have a sure kill, and again, his sure hit is harmless. So unless you think that his domain's indicators, the doors and balls, if you consider them violent since Charles does call them attacks, then that's where I can see a point for Hakari to not be able to use his domain expansion, because maybe Higuruma's no violence rule would detect that his domain, after the sure hit process, still enacts a sense of violence.
But if I remember correctly, they're all visual effects, meaning they don't actually affect their opponent. So with that being more of the visual effects, with the fact that the sure hit is also harmless, do you think maybe he might be able to bypass that no violence rule? I actually do think this leans a lot more to Hakari in terms of the domain clash. We already got confirmation that his domain sure hit is even faster than Mahito's, quicker than Mahito's 0.2. You also get something that I will have to see if I can find the post for you from the Twitter user. His name's Blzkn, and he posted something about Hakari's sure hit being very strong in push and pull. So it also suggests that even in a tug of war, he most likely is going to win for two reasons, which I'm guessing: one, his activation speed is just very quick, and two, it might be something special with Hakari's domain expansion. Now, for the simple fact that Higuruma hasn't really had any notable name or mention about his activation speed, I'm assuming because Hakari's sure hit is instantaneous, because it's the info dump, then he starts rolling and doing other things. I'm assuming in this case that he would actually be able to get his domain quicker than Higuruma does, which means that Higuruma would be at significant disadvantage, that even if his domain expansion does work, I do believe Hakari would have already started rolling, and he shouldn't be affected by any no violence rule or anything.
Yeah, I think I actually agree with you, because it was stated before that Higuruma's domain will only be activated once its rules are explained up to a certain extent, and that's considered a requirement for his domain. So, I mean, we even saw in the Sukuna fight that Higuruma was repeating the rules of deadly sentencing until he was interrupted by Sukuna, but this further supports that a portion of his rules must be explained first. So in the case that Hakari uses his domain before Higuruma can finish explaining those rules, logically, the harmless sure hit should affect Higuruma, and that will technically bypass the whole no violence aspect, because once that happens, it just becomes a classic closed barrier versus closed barrier matchup, and we know that a type of matchup like that always depends on who has the more refined domain. As of course, you already mentioned that important translation note by Lightning, where yeah, Hakari's domain is stated to be more powerful in a tug of war against other domains. Also, I'm just assuming deadly sentencing is a closed barrier because with open barriers, we can usually see the outside world, but in Higuruma's domain, we can't. At the end of the day, even if you disagree that Hakari wouldn't be able to use his domain in the middle of the court trial, that's fine too, because me and Blzkn already talked about that scenario and established that a fight in both their base forms would result in Hakari still winning. So, moving on into our last scenario, we have the very unlikely 1% chance that Hakari receives the death penalty at the end of a court trial. This would not only confiscate his technique or the ability to use his domain expansion, but it would also give Higuruma the executioner sword. So, Blzkn, what do you say happens here?
As #1 Hakari fan, he is cooked. It's very unfortunate he is cooked. I mean, at the end of the day, that executioner sword is, from what we know, because I mean, we're about to see what happens with Sukuna. Maybe there's something hidden that we don't know about. But the way it has been described, there's supposed to be one hit and you're dead. And even though I do believe Hakari is physically more imposing, faster, durability, yada yada yada, all that doesn't really matter when you do have a one-shot sword. So to me, it's just a matter of when he gets hit rather than if anything. So the only way he could potentially get out of it if he asks for a retrial and then he switches the thing in the same manner that Yuji did. But that is the only way I can see Hakari potentially wheezing out of it. Because if he asks for a retrial, they then trial him on something else, maybe he gets through with that. That is the best way. But aside from that, if it's an actual just combat, yeah, he's good. I can't see any other way. But what are you thinking?
Nah, I mean, you nailed that perfectly. Agree with everything you said. As someone who loves Higuruma's character, literally made a separate video defending this man from a controversial allegation. Yeah, I gotta be honest here. This was a freebie scenario for him. With chapter 224's explanation on the layers of difficulty with getting the death penalty, I just don't think Hakari would ever receive that. But in the 1% chance he does, then yeah, Higuruma is killing Hakari with the execution sword. But to summarize all the results from their unique matchups, if Hakari is able to open his domain while being in Higuruma's domain, then jackpot Hakari would win. If Hakari is not able to use his domain, then base Hakari, who would get the confiscation penalty, would still win against Higuruma, but it would be a tough fight due to Higuruma having reverse curse technique. If they both open their domains at the exact same time, like Gojo and Sukuna did, then Hakari would win in that scenario, since he's got a faster domain activation plus the tug of war advantage. And lastly, if Higuruma manages to get the death penalty on Hakari, then Higuruma would win by just touching Hakari once with the executioner sword. So counting the tallies of all 4 scenarios, Hakari would take the victory 3-1. Huge thank you to Blzkn for spending the time of his day to do this collab with me. Blzkn, please go ahead and plug all your socials.
Hey, I appreciate it. Obviously, thank you again for having me. I appreciate it. It was a good fun. Obviously, you can check me out on YouTube. I post when I can. I can't even stay consistent anymore. I'm kind of fraudulent. But I'll try to be some more consistent. So just check me out on YouTube. I really do appreciate it.